Well, thank you everyone for this chance. I'm Matias Flores. I'm from Chile. I'm studying my PhD in the US for the last 4 years. This presentation is we created with Agustin Cano Menoni from Uruguay. He couldn't be here today, but I'm gonna make the presentation. First of all, I wanted to say how honored I am of being here in this country. I grew up in a family that was in the 70s and the 80s fighting against the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. And my family had to go to the exile. And in the exile, they met fellows from South Africa that were fighting against apartheid. So I grew up listening of all these stories, and so I'm really happy and honored to be here in a country of freedom fighters. The presentation is around the history of the historiography of community engagement, and this started last year when Agustin and I and Romina from Argentina, we presented in this conference an article that now is published in this journal around the history of community engagement in Latin America, particularly the critical perspective of community engagement. Out of that work, we decided to make a continuation based on the call for this conference in terms of the necessary understanding of our past and the necessary global dialogue between the South and the South. We decided to make this work that was reviewing how historians and scholars have been telling the history of community engagement in Latin America, analyzing their decisions of their praxiological decisions and methodological decisions. So our theoretical framework to understand this area is, first of all, understanding that history is something that is always silencing an aspect of the past. So you decide with what kind of stories you will tell, while some others will be forgotten. Usually the subaltern and marginalized communities are not part of how the history is constructed, and that we wanted to apply for the history of community engagement. Another thing that is connected with what we heard in the keynote speaker session is that the university is full of myths in terms of how we understand our own practice and our own institution. One of those myths is the myth of the ivory tower. There's no such thing as an ivory tower in the universities. They were always connected with the community. They were always connected with the society, but in different shapes and forms that we don't want to acknowledge. There were, as we heard, criminal relationships. There were colonial relationships. There were patriarchal relationships. Community engagement, we understand it from a socio-historical perspective. So we don't see community engagement from a managerial perspective, so trying to improve community engagement or looking just at the best practices. We don't also work under a normative perspective, trying to say to you how community engagement should be. We're trying to understand how community engagement have been changing around time, how community engagement have been changing in different contexts. And so we understand it, we have a definition of community engagement as a crystallization of a dispute of different ways of understanding the borders of the universities. So out of that dispute, we don't see the polysemy of community engagement and the different concepts that exist in English and Spanish and different languages to call and name this practice. We see it as a characteristic of this practice. So it changes because the context changes and the ideas behind the connection of one understanding of the university and certain kind of society changes over time. So we need history to understand those processes and the cyclical erasure of community engagement. I could talk about it a bit later. So just to make a illustration of what we mean. This is a picture of one of my archival works in the US, looking at a community engagement antecedents that they were calling it university extension in a a small college in Kentucky, in the south of the U.S. Berea College, they had this, in the 19th century, this program of scholars that were sent to the mountains of Kentucky. So they were using these carts and horses to take the scholars from the university and leave them for weeks. And so more people could access to higher education and have an opportunity to have access in education. They were really, really progressive in the south of the US, including African Americans and women. How they tell the story of their programs is usually like this kind of pictures, showing the heroic effort from this university. In the archives, I was able to look at different things. For example, this picture that was part of our report, in which one of the professors and the scholars that were participating in this project, while they were driving in the mountains, they fell out of a cliff. And they had to suspend the event. It's kind of a funny event, but so they fall into this hole. And the report was talking about these challenges that they were facing while they were doing this kind of work, which was different to the official history that I was recovering in the more heroic kind of events. When we want to think about history of community engagement, we try to think about this other layer of failures, of falling on different holes that usually we don't want to talk about it. So we conducted a systematic review of 22 publications in Chile, in Uruguay, in Mexico. I cannot talk about all of this, and in Latin America in general. So studies that were collecting different countries in Latin America, they were trying to understand the different complexities of it. We studied the positionality of the authors, so who was talking about the history, the goals that they had while writing these pieces, their analytical focus points, and the sources that they were using. In terms of the positionality, we discover, or we found two different groups. From the one hand, university members, scholars, engaged scholars, practitioners, or university leaders. That were the majority of the authors. They were telling the history of community engagement in a way of validating their own work. And the second group were professional historians or graduate students that were trying to understand from the discipline of history what is the meaning of community engagement. We make this difference because you will see how the goals of how we look at the history will change depending on who is talking, are the voices that are constructing this history. The analytical focus points are mostly located in institutions, so it's recovering the history of one institution, one university. Others are working on the different changes of the concepts. Others are locating this debate of community engagement within broader debates on pedagogies and political debates. And the less are adding a layer of the socio-historical and cultural context. And even less are focusing on the individuals that were active participants of these projects. The sources mostly were secondary sources, which is telling about the quality of this kind of work. They were using the president discourses, the history of the university's publication, the memoirs from engaged scholars, the history of student movement, the history of each country. The use of primary sources were mostly of conference proceedings, authors' experiences, university documents, legislation and norms, university council meeting notes or minutes, oral history, interviews, testimonies, and press releases. In terms of goals, we found two main narratives, or two ways of telling the story of community engagement in Latin America. On the one hand is the epic narrative that is always trying to understand the role of, they were always trying to recover a pedagogical and political legacy in Latin America. They are often linked with a generation that is trying to that is experiencing a dispute, and it's always a nostalgic view of the past, and trying to make a retrospective of a past that was more radical, more transformative, and that was interrupted constantly by different sociopolitical events in Latin America. The techno-academic narrative, on the other hand, were more aligned with the idea of the ivory tower. So they were understanding that community engagement was always there as a way of this ivory tower illuminating the community, and the events in the history of Latin America where it was more connected with social movement were exceptions, were episodic events, that they're always turning back to the core idea of the university that is isolated. They're usually, criticizes these experiences as in moments where engaged scholars went too far of the natural work of the university. For example, one example in the case of Chile of this epic narrative is when in the 60s and the 70s, with the uprising of social movements and revolutionary projects, the universities were trying to recover the student movement of the early 20th century that reformed the Latin American university. So they were saying, well, we want to go back to the history because we know that in the past we had this trajectory that was forgotten, and we need to recover. Something similar is happening now in the critical community engagement perspective, when they are returning to the 60s and the 70s and the legacy of Paulo Freire, for example, and how they can recover that past that was mostly forgotten or eliminated during the dictatorship in Chile. So these groups is always remembering us the violent interruption in the history of community engagement. In the case of the techno-academic narrative, on the other hand, telling the same history of Chile, they see how the 60s and the 70s were an exception, that were too radical, too polarized, and then the dictatorship was a way of getting back into this idea of engagement that is more traditional, that is more academic, scientific. Both have weaknesses in a way that the epic narrative usually dismisses the analysis of the more conservative ways of engaging. So, for example, they don't look at how the university functioned during the dictatorship, and how they assume that the dictatorship eliminated community engagement, but that's not true. They continue the programs in a different way. So they are not this epic narrative is not looking at those kind of practices. The techno-academic narrative is not looking and is silencing the early history of community engagement in the beginning of the 20th century, where it became a practice that was between the student movement, the early labor movement, the workers movement, even the women movement in Chile, or in Latin America in general. So they are also forgotten, letting behind certain kind of narratives. The implications of this work is that, as both of those narratives have weaknesses, both of them are political. Even if one of them are trying to depoliticize the history of community engagement, both are understanding the connection of the university, the context, and its conflict. They are both challenging the myth of the ivory tower, even if some of them tries to always take the practices back into this imaginary. But history, when you go back, you will see that there's always a connection with the community. And the lessons for a South dialogue, we understand it has an exchange of reciprocal questions. So these questions applies both for Latin America and any other place. How are we telling our stories and our histories? Can we identify similar practices in the past under different names, concepts, and labels? Here in the conference, we'll hear about the Black consciousness movement, for example, or any traces of racist kind of community engagement in the past. How do we value the polarized moments in community engagement? What can we learn out of those moments? When I arrived last week, I was able to go to the Apartheid Museum, and in an exhibition of Nelson Mandela and his life, they were recovering how he was a leader, comrade, negotiator, prisoner, and a statesman. And there was this small part of it that I was shocking and impressive, how they were understanding their imprisonment as a way of education, as another way of creating a university life. So there are different moments in which freedom fighters, activists, and social movements are creating their own way of creating knowledge. How this knowledge, how important is where this kind of places and activities and projects, if you want, for the conditions that we are living today. Is Nelson Mandela one of the first engaged scholars in this context? In terms of recommendations, we want to invite for future studies, both in Latin America and in other places, on reflecting on the positionality of who is writing the history. What are our intentions out of it? The focus points, we will try to think about, well, if we are focusing on the institution, we'll be silencing the individuals. If we're focusing on a program, we will be silencing other aspects. The social historical context is one of the most forgotten focus point, analytical focus point in the history that we reviewed. In terms of sources, always trying primary sources. The universities have their own archives that we usually don't visit, but they are really friendly and trying to access those kind of informations. And also, there are some strategies that, for example, looking at the history of one person that was relevant and a referent of an engaged scholar can lead to other kind of sources and other kind of research. I will share an example of that later. So we recommend also starting with one focus point, either the context, the institution, the concepts, the conferences, the programs, the individuals, but then expanding to a multifocal point analysis. And also always trying to trace the global dialogue and the global relations. Those global dynamics could be imperial relations, colonial relations, solidarity relations, or intellectuals. And also the individual connections. Just to illustrate this is an example of my own research. For my master thesis, I focus on the history of one woman in Chile. So I started with this history of community engagement that was told by the institutions. I followed the history of this woman that was the first woman to become a professor in Chile in 1922, feminist leader in the early stages of the feminist movement. And out of that process, I discovered her own concept of community engagement, the conference where she attended, the global relations that she had. And out of all of those three aspects, I've been able to continue that research. For example, in the US, I visited Berea College, was one of the influences of her. I noticed the relationship with Leo Rowe, which became the president of the Pan American Union. So now I can understand the relation of the community engagement and the US imperialist project in the 20th century. In the case of the concept, that turned out to a conversation with the University of Chile, where she was teaching, and now we're in a project of recovering the history of the concept of community engagement in that institution. So opening a project with one focus point could lead you to different ones. And just to close, because I am on time, I would like to say that we are eager to promote a broader field of recovering the history of community engagement in different places. So we are open to share this work and to share collaborative projects with anyone here. So thank you so much, and well, I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you for bringing this very interesting topic and research to this conference in South Africa and putting it on the table here. Very interesting questions that you are leaving us with. So let's get a few questions. We've got 5 minutes. Yes, again there, one hand. Any other questions? Yeah, good.
Matthias, just one question. How much of literature is available on the history of community engagement in Latin American countries?
Take both questions and then you can answer. You, yeah. And first, yeah. And then you can take it. Beatrix, is that you? Yeah. Good.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was very, very interesting. And I think what resonated with me was you talked about history under theoretical frameworks as silencing the past. And I mean, I was so impressed when you saying, you know, your parents and how they engage with liberation movement fighters here in the country. And I've always been concerned about that in our country. Our past is our past. It's part of our identity, whether it was good or bad, as part of our identity. And I think sometimes, and I'm sure it's not unique to South Africa, we just sometimes just put that under the carpet. And it's really silencing. Then we just move on, and then 20, 30 years later, a bomb explodes, you know, because of that. So I thought that was very interesting, and that's what's really happening in our country as well. So maybe just your thoughts on that.
Okay. Thank you. And then Beatrix over there.
Good morning. So I've got a relationship with CLIES in South America, and they have just recently published the history of service learning in South America and in Africa on their website of Universitaria. So there's a lot of literature available. And what I want to comment on that is that because much of the literature is in Spanish or Portuguese, it's not open to us to read in South Africa when we're not familiar with the language. So in the development of technology, I think a lot of it is going to open up to us, but there's a rich history available. But what I want to refer to, and I want to get a comment from our presenter on this, is this cyclical erasure idea. So Solidaridad was the history of the South American Argentinian approach in terms of starting service learning. However, now with the change in a new political leadership, the role of political leadership in how universities engage, I think, becomes very important. And maybe if we really have to extract it, it's about keeping the conversation going and not getting those things to dictate what we're doing.
Thank you. Matthias?
Yes. So a lot of the literature that we have available is been through engaged scholars. So it started like that. So there are testimonies. So in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s, scholars usually we didn't have this technology. They wrote their memoirs, or they wrote their their presentation. They are somewhere. So it's been tracing those testimonies, and also we have in Latin America something really special that is a sense of unity within the continent. So we share a language, and well, there's Portuguese, but we want to say that we understand each other, and so we can trace those things in different places. So we feel that part of a history, and so we are reading different history of in different countries. So that's allow us to trace people that was gathering, but also we had these moments that are narrated here in this paper on the conference of community engagement. So universities were gathering since the 58 to discuss community engagement. So we have that. The other thing is that about the past and silencing the past. That was the idea of this car that was falling on a cliff. we don't want to talk about that when we are sharing our histories of community engagement. But the history of community engagement is not just the history of the university, it's the history of the community. And our communities are contradictory. They have violence in our past, and that's part of our history. And if we don't see that, we will be falling from to different holes in different moments in the future. So it's being aware of that, and the cyclical erasure. It is something that community engagement suffers both in general terms, but even within our universities. So, for example, in Chile, what happens is when there's a very good community engagement program, it then becomes a research project of the academic, and they will never say that it started as a community engagement program, and that will erase that the role and importance of community engagement in the history of the university in general. And if you're thinking broader in terms of the universities and the history of the universities and all that, if we are only looking at the policies of the universities, if we are only looking at the discourses of the presidents of the university or the rectors of the universities, you will always have the history of men's and probably non-engaged scholars, because engaged scholars will never get into those positions of power. So you will be reading a history. You cannot read the whole history just through those things. And yeah, there's this new book on the global history of service learning, and I think it's every year there are more elements that we can use, and I think this conference will help also to have more antecedents in the African history. So thank you so much.